This forest is as majestic and as beautiful as any in the world. It's part of a towering karri forest in the heart of Australia's southwest. The karri trees themselves are amongst the biggest living things on Earth. Only the Californian redwood and the eastern Australian mountain ash are bigger. This giant Western Australian timber has a girth of up to 10 metres at its base and a magnificent trunk of straight, tall timber that stretches 80 metres into the sky before it stretches out its canopy of leaves into the sunlight. Many of these trees would weigh more than 100 tons, and yet it's the very elegance of the way that they grow that belies their great size. In recent decades, we've become increasingly aware of the immense environmental and recreational value of our forests. We've become equally aware that timber is one of the world's greatest single resources, that we must develop it so we'll have it for all times. We have also realized that unlike many other resources, forests can be forever. Anyone would feel some sadness at the felling of a tree. A tall, proud, living thing of the forest moans in its death throes and comes crashing to the ground. There are some who believe that trees should never be felled, that it's like killing people. Well, as fatuous as it may sound, we have to remind ourselves that timber comes from trees. It's timber we must have in so many irreplaceable ways. This tree trunk, for example, has enough timber in it to build 3 normal-sized suburban homes that will give shelter to generations of families. We need and use timber in countless ways. Soon after Western Australia's settlement 150 years ago, the timber industry was to become its first worthwhile spark of economic life. Even though only 14% of this vast western third of Australia was covered with woodlands and forests, it still amounted to many hundreds of square kilometres of some of the world's finest trees. To the early settlers, the forests must have seemed endless, an unlimited supply of timber. Many of the species were unique: wandoo, tuart, salmon gum, marri, better known as red gum, and of course the now famous jarrah and karri trees. Jarrah was shipped out to win a reputation as some of the most beautiful and certainly some of the most durable timber in the world. Karri won a world reputation for its great strength in big timber lengths. Ironically, because of jarrah's great durability, much of it was hidden away as the paving blocks for the streets of London. And sleepers cut with the old-time broad axe became the foundations for the underground railways of that city, and they're still in demand today. Naturally enough, the broad axeman went from the industry many years ago. The old steam and rope drive mill at Donnelly River was the window into some of that colourful past. But in June of 1978, the knock-off whistle blew for the last time at the Donnelly. Many would see it as being the last of some of the good old days. The good old days for the timber industry were in many ways the bad old days for the forests. Conservation as a word was unheard of. Forestry as a science was decades away. In any case, the forests seemed to have endless supplies, and the timber cutters set themselves few limits, quite apart from the huge areas that were cleared for agriculture. Timber company logging manager Jerry Larkin.
They could have been the bad old days, for sure, because of the selective nature of cutting, where group selection methods were used. That's selecting a group of trees within an area and falling that group. Other methods used, or the other method mainly used, was a trade cut system where the big mature trees were removed. And the result, of course, was that the regenerated carry then never grew, never matured. It's always been suppressed by the remaining crowns.
1918 must surely go down as the most important year in the history of the timber industry in Western Australia. It was then that the Forests Act was put into the statute books and a whole new future for the forests was begun. A newly formed forest department under a Minister for Forests and a Conservator of Forests combined with the forest industry. Down the years, they've worked to develop what amounts to a revolution in forest use, planning and conservation. The cycle of forest degeneration that had established itself in the old days was stopped. Much more, it was reversed, and today we're in the midst of a colossal rebuilding program. The successes are there for all to see. The 1.8 million hectares of state forest are managed on a basis of multiple use. That means providing for a broad range of elements. On one end of the scale, the lone beekeeper operating his hives amongst the gum blossoms. At the other end of the scale, there's the responsibility of providing the huge catchments of the hills reservoirs. The conservation of samples of the forest in its natural state, and providing areas for people's enjoyment of the forests. There are 16,000 hectares of national parks in these southern forest regions and 96,000 hectares of reserve lands along roads and streams. Also, there are 2 fauna and flora reserves totaling 49,000 hectares. Huge bushland tracts that will never be touched. Of course, there is the planning for the operations of today's modern timber industry. This is the Jardee mill near Manjimup, and it's pretty typical of the rather incredible automation that's to be seen in the timber industry today. That's the biggest log carriage in Australia. A big carry like this fellow goes through the entire system within a matter of 20 minutes or so. Jardee is operated by one of the big sawmillers, and the other big timber companies have the same standards of mechanization. Operation at Greenbushes, push-button production in a mill town that survived from the last century. It's one of the mills cutting jarrah, famed for its magnificent furniture finishes. And at Dean Mill, another of the really old timber towns near Manjimup, there's now the biggest and most modern mill in the state. Western Australia has 130 registered sawmills, many of them, of course, only small operations. Each is given a strictly supervised timber quota so that no mill can exceed its permissible log intake. Output from the mills is only the beginning. For example, this is the Manjimup Production Centre, a big timber manufacturing complex that is typical of the industry created from the forests. It's fed from the surrounding mills, and with its workforce and manufacturing strength, is in itself a major influence on the economies of the nearby towns and the region as a whole. Another example of important industry being created from the forest is this particle board manufacturing plant at Dardanup near Bunbury. All of its output comes from the man-made pine forests, and even then, most of it from thinnings, the trees culled out of plantations to make room for bigger growth. And yet from it comes a really superb building material for use throughout Australia and for export. Everything is used, even the bark of the pines, which is sold for garden landscaping. All of this production from forests that would not have existed had it not been for the planning of the industry. Other elements of timber production. Roof trusses being manufactured at Kewdale near Perth. At nearby Cannington, the production of transportable homes which are trucked to points all over the state. In Victoria Park, plywood manufacture. Timber layers are peeled or sliced from the finest jarrah and carry logs. Also at Kewdale, the three biggest timber companies, each with a major manufacturing centre. Thousands of people employed across a major industry. The source of all that activity, the forest itself. We've learnt much about it in the past decades. As we often see nowadays in this age of progress and science, even nature's ways can be improved upon. And it's true here too, where man is rebuilding his forests and improving them in very spectacular ways. But not all the progress is understood. Three aspects of forestry development which fit that situation. Firstly, the use of prescribed forest burns. Secondly, the introduction of the wood chipping industry. Thirdly, the clear fell method of regenerating forest areas. Let's have a look at them. This aircraft is on a bombing mission to set fire to the forests. As dramatic as that might sound, it's really quite an ordinary event during the cooler seasons in the southwest. The crew is flying a pattern over a selected forest section And their bombs are in fact capsules armed with chemicals in a machine before being released through a tube in the aircraft's belly. The capsules ignite on the forest floor to start what is known as prescribed mild burns. These cool season burns consume litter and matted undergrowth without causing any real or lasting damage to the forest ecology. All this is done to reduce the risk of a major summer fire that could rage out of control for days or even weeks to destroy huge forest areas. So over the ages, many eucalypts have developed so that they grow faster if they're subjected to fires of reasonable intensity. So what happens to the animals and the birds of the forests in fire situations? A man who has spent many years of study on the subject, zoologist and senior forest research officer, Pierre Christensen.
Well, the animals of the forest have an amazing capacity to survive fires. In fact, they're adapted to periodic fires in the habitat. Now, the Forest Department has done research over the last 10 years on various species, both some of the smaller animals, some of the bigger ones, the birds, and this particular animal, the woolly or rat-tailed kangaroo, which lives out in the eastern country in the Wandoo forest, has been followed and tracked using small radio tracking devices, and we've actually followed them during a fire. I think we had something like 30 animals at one stage with small radio transmitters, and out of the 30 we only lost one in a fairly fierce fire. Now, this one animal in fact ran up inside a hollow log, and the log caught fire. All the other animals waited until the fire came very close, and then they actually went through the flames and onto the burnt country and survived on the burnt country. This is fairly typical, in fact, of many species in the way that they survive fires.
This rather impressive little mountain is made entirely of wood chips, tons of them. Some time back, it was the centre of a controversy surrounding the building of a wood chipping mill at Manjimup and its outlet port here at Bunbury. Some people believed, it seems, that the southwest forest would be destroyed and end up as pulp. This single facility has contracts to load out $200 million worth of wood chips to Japan over 15 years. A very impressive export industry. Even more impressive is the fact that what they're actually exporting is a timber residue, something that would normally be burned. It's timber of this type that comes to the wood chip plant at Manjimup. Every log here is totally unfit for any other timber purpose. The hearts of the trunks are split, or they have ring shakes, perhaps big gum pockets. Mostly they're marri trees, or red gums as you might call them. All logs that come here must be cleared for chipping by a Forest Department inspector. In any case, if any log was suitable for the sawmill, it'd certainly be there because it would bring about 4 times as much as it does here as wood chips. So we have a wood chip plant that's earning big export income and thus boosting our balance of trade. 20% of the chip mill's output is residue brought in from sawmills, 100,000 tons of it every year. Previously, this material was burnt. Here, it becomes a valuable export. We must not overlook the initial reason for the mill. It's simply a clearinghouse, disposing of vast quantities of salvage material from forest areas that will be grown anew. And that leads us to the important aspect of forest regeneration. Old trees and young trees don't grow up well together. They're in constant conflict, each working against the progress of the other. The big trees overcrowd the little ones, blocking out their sunlight and often killing them in this way. At the same time, the young trees starve the older ones of moisture and nutrient. It's a no-win situation for both age groups. That's why sections of the forest have been selected for clear felling. Each clear-felled pocket is usually about 70 hectares, with a maximum of 200 hectares. The initial appearance of clear-felled areas is alarming. All usable timber in the plot is taken away. The good logs to the sawmills and the poor ones to the chip mill. Seed trees are left as the parents of the new forest. The remaining debris around the seed trees is fired, and what is left looks to be a hopeless ruin. But that's not really the situation. Senior Forest Research Officer Peter Kimber.
The farmer does a similar operation in the way of ploughing, and you wouldn't call his turning over of the soil in this manner destructive. It's part of the cycle of growing, part of agriculture. Similarly, the gardener prunes his rose bush to prevent it becoming straggly and to get large, healthy blooms and a vigorous and healthy bush. And that's called horticulture. What we're doing here is called silviculture.
As in nature, the clear-fell method of growing forests uses fire to create a fertile ash bed, and the heat of that same fire to trigger the opening of the seed capsules. Where the method improves on nature is that it can boost numbers where they may be deficient by the addition of nursery-produced seedlings and give every hectare of the forest the best possible growing conditions. Instead of the young trees struggling into a world of shade beneath established trees, these young carriers can push up together, each getting its share of sunshine, each growing strong, each with the prospect of survival. Over the years, there emerges another section of forest where every tree is as beautiful as these. How do we know? Well, this stand of karri grew from only a few chance parent trees in a wheat paddock abandoned a century ago here at Lefroy Brook near Pemberton. Many people may not realize that the forest has resulted from the same regrowth practice now being used. And there are other fine examples, such as here along the Lefroy Brook at Pemberton on what is now called the Rainbow Trail. It follows what was once the old railway into the Pemberton Mills, and it's now one of the most spectacular tourist roads in the state. The karri are only about 50 years old, and yet already they've reached magnificent proportions. Elsewhere in the state, other man-made forests have already reached maturity. These big pines are part of the 2,400 hectare Grimwade plantation, 200 kilometres south of Perth. They were planted just 45 years ago. Across the state, there are 42,000 hectares of state pine plantations and about 11,000 hectares of private plantations at varying stages of development. Already they're providing a significant amount of timber. It's planned that by the year 2000, pines will provide us with much of our commercial timber needs. This increasing availability of softwood means that the cutting of hardwood is being reduced. In fact, softwoods will largely take over for a period to allow the balance between hardwood growth and yield to be restored. The timber that has been used throughout the 150-year history of Western Australia is now being replaced many times over. This Forest Department nursery, for example, grows 2.5 million young karri trees every year. Our generation has appreciated for the first time the finite nature of planet Earth's resources. What is taken is gone forever, be it coal, oil, iron ore, copper, gold, zinc, tin, whatever. Ironically, one of the longest used resources, timber, can outlast them all. It's one of the few renewable resources. Whether or not future generations will want to use the forests as we have will be entirely up to them. At least we will have left them with the choice, and left them with the proof that forests are forever.